This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with James O'Brien.
4 minutes after 10 is the time. You might want to sit down for the first observation I'm going to make this morning. And I'm afraid I didn't spot it myself. You may well think that I should have done. I would probably agree. But I am grateful to the Financial Times columnist, Gideon Rachman, for this insight. I think he's the fella that also first pointed out that Donald Trump always chickens out when he's in a sort of tete-a-tete, a tariff tete-a-tete. So enjoying quite a nice little season, Gideon Rachman. But he has established a Brexit benefit, a genuine benefit of Brexit. You heard it here second. The only way that the UK was able to sanction the hideous Israeli politicians Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, and I will be justifying the use of the word hideous shortly, is because we're not in the European Union. Did you know that? Did anybody else spot that? So why are we acting with Norway, Canada, Australia and New Zealand? Answer, because the EU could not secure internal agreement to sanction these two men. Presumably because of Hungary. I don't know whether that's true or not, but authoritarians tend to flock together, don't they? And Viktor Orban may well have been the fly in this particular ointment, but there it is. I mean, that puts some people in quite a strange position for reasons I don't think we could go into today because they're too opaque and confusing. But people who perhaps would think that today is a day to talk about Greta Thunberg's viewing habits rather than the sanctioning of two members of a supposed ally government would also generally have been in favour of leaving the European Union. And yet it is only because we've left the European Union that we can focus our opposition on these two characters so effectively. And anyway, I just thought that was an interesting observation, don't you? Actually, speaking of this idea that the Israeli propaganda machine has managed to inject into the usual corners of the of the British media sewers, what would they have done? Would they have put matchsticks in her eyes if she just said, I don't want to watch this film? I don't want to watch this film, for example, until you let journalists into Gaza so that people can see what's happening there. Otherwise, this would be a very, very deliberately unbalanced attempt to sway public opinion. Would they put matchsticks in her eyes to force her to watch the thing? What a strange question it is to ask whether somebody should be compelled to watch something they don't want to watch while being held captive after being effectively kidnapped in international waters. But hey-ho, moral compasses are very strange things. Who knows where they will end up pointing next? For example, I guess Smotrich and Ben-Gvir presumably have supporters. I heard a bloke on the BBC yesterday having the most extraordinary meltdown while being incredibly insulting about this country, which of course has been an incredibly steady and committed ally to Israel through thick and through thin. And that's what I'm interested in today. I'm interested in the relationship you have with your government in the UK as a consequence of what they have done with regard to Israel. Australia, Canada, New Zealand and Norway joining the UK to place sanctions on Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, largely for inciting violence against Palestinians in their campaign to gain control of new settlements in the West Bank. You will know, if you follow this programme, even vaguely closely, that the track records, the CVs of these two men are extraordinary when you consider that they've managed to scale relatively dizzy heights of power in Benjamin Netanyahu's Israel. Their past associations, their past behaviour, their past conduct, their past comments would make them persona non grata in most democracies, but not, of course, in this one. Travel bans, the freezing of assets in the 5 relevant countries, that's Australia, Canada, New Zealand, Norway and the United Kingdom, and the freezing of assets and travel bans being pretty hefty sanctions for foreign countries, including nominal allies, to impose. We are steadfastly committed to the two-state solution and will continue to work with our partners towards its implementation. This is a statement by David Lammy and his fellow foreign ministers in the 4 other countries. It is the only way to guarantee security and dignity for Israelis and Palestinians and ensure long-term stability in the region. Smotrich has said that there's no such thing as a Palestinian nation, but Ben Gvir has spoken of his rights in the illegally occupied territories within the West Bank being more important than the rights of millions of Palestinians. The expansion of West Bank settlements, illegal under international law, campaigning against allowing humanitarian aid into Gaza, saying just last month that Gaza will be entirely destroyed and that Palestinians would leave in great numbers to third countries. There's a word for that kind of policy, isn't there, historically? Ben Gvir has called for the expulsion of all Palestinians from Gaza. He's talked about there being no need to bring in aid because they apparently have enough. Another lie that you can only make if you're preventing foreign journalists from getting into the territory. And on it goes. On it goes. I don't know if you were listening yesterday, and a caller picked up on that comment that Keir Starmer made at the very outset when he, according to his own account, when he accidentally endorsed the I think a pretty clear war crime of cutting off the supply of water or electricity into the Gaza Strip and rode back almost as quickly as he rode into it. But it reminded me of 2 things that many people had forgotten about. The first is that the electoral damage that this did to Labour got lost in the scale of the landslide, didn't it? The electoral damage that this did to Labour was pretty immense. They lost actual seats. They lost really safe seats to independent candidates who were standing on an almost exclusively pro-Palestinian platform. It did them enormous damage. David Lammy has historically been a very outspoken critic of atrocities undertaken by Israel against Palestinian people. And many people felt that he had, sat on his hands or wound down his opposition. Whereas, of course, there is an enormous difference between being in opposition and being in power. I have said for some time, we have to be grown up about this. I've got 2 central guiding stars when we wade into this territory. The first, as you probably know by now, is that I refuse to consider one life worth less than another. It's very simple, very straightforward. If you start from the position that a Palestinian life is worth the same as an Israeli life, that a dead Palestinian child is as heartbreaking as a dead Israeli child, then you can't end up anywhere but in support of a 2-state solution. The only way you can really endorse the kind of ideas that Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben Gvir endorse is by subscribing to a form of supremacy, by subscribing to a belief that you have more right to life or land or both than people who were born under a different star. So that's point number 1. Some people really hate that, It's very strange. Some people absolutely hate the idea that you feel the same humanitarian angst over the death of a Palestinian child that you do over an Israeli child. And the second sort of guiding light for me on this stuff is the difference between power and opposition. That may not sound as important as the first point, but when it comes to analysing politics, it really is. It really, really is. The difficulties of diplomacy are legion. Books have been written. Tomes, volumes, entire libraries have been written about the difficulties of diplomacy. I remember talking. It's interesting, isn't it, that full disclosure interviews I reference the most are not necessarily the ones that I realise at the time have sown so many seeds in my own mind and memory. But once again, I refer you to Kenneth Roth, the former head of Human Rights Watch, 30 years, essentially defining modern human rights campaigning, and now latterly the author of a truly brilliant book, Righting Wrongs, 3 decades on the front lines battling abusive governments. And I think the reason that has stayed with me so much is he sits down with truly hideous humans. I may get some of the details wrong, but in Bashar al-Assad or Saddam Hussein, people visiting appalling treatments on their own people, their own citizens. And my somewhat childish approach, or my somewhat immature approach to hideous people, is to avoid them like the plague. You somehow endorse their regime by breaking bread with the leader. It's really silly. Sometimes you need to meet deeply impressive people to realize your own mistakes, don't you? Sometimes you almost need other people to lead by example. If you want to get someone released from prison in an authoritarian regime, you have to do stuff with that authoritarian regime. It's no good wearing a badge or waving a flag or turning up at Speaker's Corner on Sunday morning to condemn that regime and all who sail in her. You want to get these people out of prison. You want to protect populations from vicious dictators. You have to deal with those regimes. You have to deal with those individuals. And I can't believe I'm today years old before I really got my head around that. And it was largely thanks to Kenneth Roth and his book, Righting Wrongs, 3 decades on the front line. And that's what I mean by the difference between diplomacy, the difference between power and opposition, the difference between activism, which was a word we examined a little bit yesterday, the difference between activism and diplomacy or politics. So the British government became, in many ways, an emblem of what we have tracked quite effectively on this programme, what we've chronicled together pretty well over the last years, which is I still believe the necessity of a, quote, robust response to the atrocities of October the 7th, but also an acknowledgement that things moved pretty quickly over a line of acceptability. The Irish government was moving in that direction by February of 2024. February the 14th, I think, I've got stuck in my head as the date on which it happened. The British government has been lagging behind, but of course its historic relationship with Israel is very different from Ireland's. And today, or yesterday, we arrived at the place where a foreign minister, a British foreign minister and his counterparts in 4 foreign governments could say that Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich have incited extremist violence and serious abuses of Palestinian human rights. These actions are not acceptable. This is why we have taken action now to hold those responsible to account. They were both beyond the pale even of Israeli politics until relatively recently, when Netanyahu's electoral position became sufficiently fragile to need the support of people who would once have been considered persona non grata or pariahs. But they prop up his regime, they prop up his government, and they keep him out of court, which is why they've been able to enjoy levels of profile that they've never enjoyed previously. Did you know that Smotrich was arrested in 2005 by Israeli security services about his plans or his role in protests over Israel's plans to withdraw from Gaza? There were claims that he, allegedly, on suspicion of planning to block roads and damage infrastructure to try to block the withdrawal. He then set up an NGO focused on control of occupied land. He has declared himself to be a fascist homophobe. He thinks that Arab and Jewish mothers should be separated in maternity wards. And he organised a beast parade as a protest against gay pride. He sounds like a absolute charmer, doesn't he? Ben-Gvir, meanwhile, has a photograph of the mass murderer, a portrait of the mass murderer in his living room, or did at least for several years. Barak Goldstein gunned down 29 Palestinians in a mosque in 1994. They're both admirers of an extremist rabbi called Mir Kahane. Again, he comes into power because Netanyahu needed his support. He gets the security portfolio. So I wonder whether some British journalists should be forced to watch videos of that massacre in 1994 in order to get an idea of the kind of guy that the security minister of Israel considers to be a hero. That's just a thought. What do you think of this? I want you to try, I don't want to sound like a school teacher, I want you to try to remember the difference between power and opposition, the difference between power and protest, what governments can do, what politicians in power can and cannot do. Very different play sheet, a very different tactical palette from what you have when you are merely protesting, when you're merely waving flags and wearing badges. So our government has imposed sanctions, pretty hefty sanctions, on 2 senior members of an ally, of an ally's government. What do you think of that? Because I'm leaning towards the idea that Lammy and Starmer have got this absolutely right. You might say too little too late, and I may agree with you if you persuade me, but given the difficulties of diplomacy and the necessity of unity, the fact that you move with 4 other countries, I think this is a great day for humanity. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. What do you think?
James O'Brien on LBC.
21 minutes after 10 is the time. And it wasn't that long ago, was it, that British MPs were refused entry to Israel or turned away at the border? I must double-check the detail of that one, because the pearl clutching and the dummy spitting coming out of the Israeli government is extraordinary. But here we are. Finally, some would say, the UK and her allies have imposed sanctions on Israeli government ministers. How big a moment is this, either for you or as an overview? Let's start with Khalid in Enfield. Khalid, what would you like to say?
George, morning. It's a huge subject.
You can say that again.
You can say that again. I was actually in Al-Aqsa Mosque last year when Ben Gvir was inside it, inciting the destruction of the complex because of, they want to rebuild the third temple. That's another part of the sort of like the strands of conversations that he kind of expresses as well. There were huge numbers of settlers walking through the mosque, which is happening every day. And it was also, I think it was 22nd of August last year, there was the flag parade, which basically kind of cleanses the streets of all the Palestinians while young Israeli settlers are all kind of, flag waving and actually beating people up and surrounding Al-Aqsa, chanting and praying because they are looking forward to the destruction of it. And I think that it was absolutely right. We have to kind of ban people like that or sanction people like that because they like to. Israel is currently trying to say it's a Western liberal democracy. And actually, I don't think we should be friends with anybody who is inciting those values, because we as a country as well have prided ourselves on multiculturalism, fairness, democracy, equality of rights. And through my experiences of going to Israel and, being in the occupied West Bank and watching all the, the militarization that you see in the daily lives. I've been caught up in the checkpoints. I've had guns pointed at me just because that's the daily lives of Palestinians, and I happen to look like one. I think it's baby steps. I'm just going to clarify a couple of things, if I may, for people who aren't as plugged into the issues as you are. About 2,000 attacks on Palestinian civilians since January last year is the rough estimate, and Britain's belief is that extremist settlers are behind them. So the fact that these 2 characters are constantly, as you've reminded us, both encouraging and inciting that kind of behaviour is the central rationale for the sanctions. Well, I presume, and I don't want to put words into your mouth, but I know we've spoken before, I presume you have been unhappy with the British government's response to the unfolding situation. 100%. Like last night, I've got, I know Palestinian skateboarders, they're 20-something years old, they're a lovely community of young people trying to get on with their lives. And they were posting up that Nablus, which is a wonderful little city within the occupied West Bank, had been completely surrounded and was under sort of like siege. That's how far they're going. Tul Quran, they've been ripping up the place. And it's all been going on while they've been, Gaza, the genocide in Gaza is going on. I mean, it's beyond belief, I think. Well,
so talk to me then about, and I'm being a bit stentorian, because I know that you opened by saying it's a huge issue, and we're only focusing on the latest developments today. So talk to me a bit about the difference between power and diplomacy. Do you have any sympathy for the idea that the government couldn't have moved further faster, and certainly couldn't really have done it unilaterally. It couldn't have acted in isolation.
Well, there's a really, you open up a can of worms there, I think.
Well, I just want to know what you think.
They can't act in isolation. Everybody knows, every sort of like government knows what's going on in the occupied West Bank. We've been listening to the two-state solution for such a long time without any movement because there is such a powerful, it appears, you're asking about my opinion, an incredibly powerful, you asked a question a couple of weeks ago about how did we get here.
Yeah.
We
know the answer to that. I think there's some evidence of it in the British media today. It's a bit like Kidderminster Harriers or Nottingham Forest. I don't know who you support, but some people cannot conceive of not supporting that team. And it's by no means just Israelis or just Jewish people. There's plenty of people on the right and the far right of the UK media and political spectrum who cannot conceive of ever really meaningfully condemning what has been going on in the West Bank and in Gaza, however bad it gets. That's how you end up talking about Greta Thunberg's television viewing habits. It's an absolutely extraordinary position to find yourself in, but that's how we've ended up where we've ended up, because so much of the discourse in this country is defined by those people. But what do you say to me when I say to you that Starmer and Lammy have got this right?
I would say yes, they have got it right. It's almost, for someone in my position, it's a symbolic gesture because it still doesn't, deal with the root problem of dropping bombs on children in Gaza and wiping out the entire population, which is obviously going on. So the British government have to extricate themselves from a genocide, which they are in part. Well, we'll find out in years to come whether they were complicit in all of this through their arms sales and all those types of things. But between now and then, these are the steps that governments take to slowly remove themselves. And, obviously... Yeah, that's nicely
put. And that notion of international support for Israel is now non-existent. And you may not agree with me here, it's a tragedy that the goodwill of the population has been squandered by these men, most obviously Ben-Gvir, Smotrich and Netanyahu. But members of the government are queuing up to condemn us today. Gideon Saar, the foreign minister, this is a scandal. We will hold a special government meeting next week to decide on our response. So I presume he knows this, but you may not. I presume Khalid does, but you may not. I didn't. I needed to have it clarified to me by Noga, actually, Tana Polsky, our regular contributor in Israel. But in his early 30s, Ben-Gvir had been convicted of incitement to racism and support for a terrorist organisation. So you remember when Suella Braverman was telling Jewish people who were marching in solidarity with the Palestinian cause in this city, in London, when Suella Braverman was essentially calling them Hamas sympathisers or anti-Semitic, these ludicrous claims that everybody marching in support of peace was somehow an apologist for the atrocities of October the 7th. This chap actually has been convicted of support for a terrorist organisation. He has been convicted in Israel of support for a terrorist organisation. And yet today we're expected to listen to the Israeli foreign minister describing the decision to sanction him as scandalous, as a scandal. So I don't know that we, by which I mean the UK, could have moved faster, but I don't know how anybody, apart from these people essentially acting as apologists for men convicted of support for a terrorist organisation, could argue against the conclusion that we've ended up in the right place at the right time. But I'd like you to try on 0345 60 973. And again, talking of footage and films, the only reason that we know about the shooting dead of those aid workers in one of the more recent scandals was because of the footage found on the phone in the pocket of a dead man, which completely contradicted the version of events being punted by this government, two members of which have now been sanctioned by our government. I mean, the reason I use the word tragedy is because there are millions of people who see Israel as the only place to which where they can find sanctuary when it starts happening again. People in Ballymena are currently having their houses set on fire for the crime of where they were born. I can't remember any mainstream British politicians who've incited hatred against Romanian neighbours. I'm sure it'll come to me a little bit later in the programme, but that's what they're doing in Northern Ireland at the moment, setting fire to houses because they think Romanian people live there, while 2 Romanian teenagers stand accused of a deeply unpleasant crime. But you set fire to the houses of everybody, born under the same star, born under the same passport. That's a pogrom, right? Like we saw in the Farage riots in the summer. These are pogroms, attempted pogroms. So that's why Israel has such a sacred place in the minds of many, many Jewish people. But to see an administration squander that support in such a violent and self-interested fashion is to me, heartbreaking. Thomas Watts is here now with your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC.
Word squander does a lot of work, doesn't it? This is from James. My surname is Jewish. Here is the irony. My entire life I've never suffered any anti-Semitism. That is until the past 2 years. And the person I blame for that is Benjamin Netanyahu, the man who claims he is fighting to keep us safe. And Simon points out, in the context of the pogroms in Ballymena and the ones that we saw after the Southport murders during the Farage riots, like you, I'm a 53-year-old white man. Following the logic of some, we should have been attacked after the recent tragedy in Liverpool. You make an excellent point, Simon. Modesty prevents me from pointing out I may have made it myself at the time. 10:34 is the time. What I want you to talk to me about, I mean, you know how it works when we discuss Gaza and Israel. You can essentially answer any question you want. I'll just give you a little nudge in one or two directions. But today is very much a conversation about what the British government has done. It has sanctioned the finance minister and the security minister of Israel. The latter, a lifelong far-right activist. He was such an extremist as a teenager that they wouldn't let him into the Israeli Defense Force. He was considered too much of a far-right extremist for the IDF. But he's now essentially in control of the police forces that once arrested him and the jails where he was once held. One of his convictions for support for a terrorist organisation, something that people on the right of British politics and media have accused children marching for peace in Palestine of doing. He's actually been convicted for it. So there is an argument that the sanctions are too little, too late, but it's an argument I want you to make cogently. I want you to tell me what you think of what the British government has done. They hemorrhage support from some sections of the population, not just Muslim people, an awful lot of what you would describe as traditional Labour voters, horrified by the early response of Keir Starmer to the Israeli response to the October the 7th atrocities. Rightly or wrongly, that's just counting, that's not an opinion. People were, to the point where they stood as independent candidates and got elected in safe Labour seats. But I said at the time, and I'll say now, the difference between power and opposition, the difference between diplomacy and activism is huge. And I think the government, I mean, it's a horrible thing to say because there are 50,000 people dead, more. But I think the government have got it right. Do you? Ray's in Belfast. Ray, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. I love the show.
Thank you.
I'm just calling to say that I do broadly agree with the policy, but I think there's perhaps been an assumption of knowledge about how difficult it is to sanction an ally.
Yeah.
And if they maybe didn't need to say this a lot sooner, they did need to say something to give people more context. At the moment, it sort of feels as though this came out of the blue, which is obviously not the case.
Is that entirely fair? I mean, Lammy used the word monstrous not long ago and repellent to describe some of Smotrich's comments. And that is, again, it's a useful reminder of the difference between power and opposition, because those words carry much more weight when they come from the lips of a foreign secretary than they do from an opposition politician.
Yeah, I'll admit when I say this came out of the blue, I'm not necessarily talking about the most recent sanctions, but the complete change of tone seems to have sort of spun on a dime, and it's not necessarily something that was very well pitch-rolled to the extent that it could have been with a change of policy with regards to an ally. But I just don't think that they gave people enough context to understand what was going on behind the scenes to the extent that they could have.
Yeah, no, I understand what you're saying, I'll draw a parallel with Ireland. It was, Vinny reminds me, it was indeed on Valentine's Day. I think that's why it's stuck in my memory. 14th of February 2024, Ireland and Spain, the first countries to ask the European Commission to investigate suspected human rights breaches, Israeli human rights breaches in Gaza. The problem that the government had, and I don't know that I agree with you about things happening more in the open. I think the nature of diplomacy, I mean, crikey, to stay on the island of Ireland, various British governments were meeting with the IRA secretly while they were even dubbing Gerry Adams's voice on the BBC. So, you know, it doesn't happen in the open historically, does it? But the thing we all wrestled with was the point at which the Rubicon was crossed, the point at which a widespread belief that Israel not only had the right but had a necessity to respond was breached. Do you see what I mean? I don't know when the British government arrived at that conclusion. I think that's part of what you're saying.
Yeah, I just think that there was obviously a spread of options going into this and a spread of outcomes that the government could have moved towards. And while obviously you can't tell people exactly what's going on behind the scenes, there was just no information about what those options were, how it was to move alone, how it would be to move as part of a group.
Okay, yeah, okay.
And
that's really, I think about this a lot. I think about this quite a lot, actually. I don't know why, but I do think about a kind of fireside chat where the Prime Minister I mean it, I can't remember who did fireside chats. Was it Harold Wilson? Where you actually do go on television and explain the situation to the people, working on the presumption that most of us will be intelligent and open-minded enough to pay attention and recognise the reality of what you're describing. And that's what I think you want. You would have liked to have seen, like teachers say on maths exams, they want to see the working. They want to see the calculations.
That's a really great way of putting it. We should come up with it myself.
Let's pretend you did. That's what I'd do.
Thank you, James.
No, thank you. It's a really good point, because it does seem as if, you use that phrase, turn on a sixpence, as if suddenly they've woken up and decided to sanction these two men for things that they've been doing for years. I mean, literally for years. And yet the restrictions of diplomacy are such that they couldn't do it the minute they came into power, or the minute Israel crossed that invisible line between proportionate response to the Hamas attacks of October the 7th and hideously disproportionate response. 10:40 is the time. Stuart is in St Albans. Stuart, what would you like to say?
Yeah, good morning, James. Lovely show. I just for a bit of context, in your preamble, you talked about the weight that is given to the lives of Palestinian children in comparison to the weight given to the importance of life of an Israeli child.
Only by me. That's all I talked about. Well,
it seems very clear to me, obviously, that, and it should be clear to listeners, that the Israeli government does not place any value on the lives of a Palestinian child. It's clear, otherwise this abomination that's happening over there would not occur. And the reason I'm phoning, obviously, is in respect of the sanctions, but you need to everybody needs to understand that, because that's the starting point.
Just to support to support your position for people who may not pay as much attention as you do. Smotrich was the one who recently suggested that the potential deaths of 2 million Palestinians from hunger might be justifiable. So that's the kind of character we're dealing with here.
This is what we're dealing with. And my view is that people look at these sanctions, and the view you have taken is that it's a good response. Obviously, it's not a bad thing to impose sanctions on these two despicable characters. However, it won't make a difference. It won't make a difference to those two characters. It won't impact of itself on the policies of the Israeli government.
Well, what would though?
No, I don't think it. I don't think it will.
No, what would?
When I was talking to your researcher, right? Okay. I think. Well, I mean, it's not in our hands, but obviously we're out of the EU now. But they do about 42 billion in trade with Israel under this free trade agreement they have with Israel. should exert influence on the EU if we possibly can.
Trump in the White House would almost certainly cancel out anything that happens on that front. I mean, I just worry that you might be letting the perfect be the enemy of the good.
No, I'm not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good, because I fully support the sanctions.
Right.
I fully support the sanctions. We need to recognise Palestine as a state. What we have done with the sanctions against these two is symbolic. Recognising Palestine as a state would also be symbolic, but we need to take the lead on this. You mentioned earlier the need to create consensus, and I fully appreciate that. However, the situation is so drastic. I have been disappointed in the Labour government's response massively.
Yes.
But we need to take the lead. We need to say, no, we recognise Palestine as a state. We need to try and influence as well Israeli public opinion. And recognising a Palestinian state would be a message that perhaps would get through.
It looked like we were about to, didn't it? There was certainly a sense that we might have been about to last month. And plenty of other countries have. I mean, again, I think it's something that's often missing from most British media coverage is how lonely we are now, or were on the world stage, in our almost unquestioning support for Netanyahu's administration.
Dreadful. And the thing about that influencing Israeli public opinion, when I was talking to your researcher earlier, something reported on the BBC website about this, a poll that was recently conducted. I've forgotten the name of who carried out the poll, but the poll basically said, it's in today's BBC, and they said, should the suffering of civilians in Gaza play a role in determining the Israeli government's foreign policy? And over 75% of Israeli Jews said no.
I haven't seen that. I've got no reason to doubt you, but I will have to double check it. And it's a chilling statistic.
Please do check it, because I read it off the BBC website this morning, and actually I had it up when I talked to your researcher and confirmed the author of the article and the name of the polling. It's for everybody to see on the BBC website.
And that makes the challenge when it comes to public opinion almost insurmountable. I mean, impossible to conceive of, let alone actually achieve. While we are sharing statistics, Stuart, you're probably aware of this one, but a lot of people won't be. When I mentioned a moment ago about how lonely we are on the world stage in our unquestioning support for Netanyahu's administration, the state of Palestine is recognised as a sovereign state by how many of the 193 member states of the United Nations? So there are 193 member states in the United Nations. I want you to have an educated guess at how many of them recognise the state of Palestine as a sovereign state, okay? And what I want you to do, don't cheat. So base your answer on your consumption of British media and political discourse. So as someone who lives in a country where the Daily Mail reigns supreme and Suella Braverman can achieve high office in various governments, what answer would you give to the question of how many of the 193 member states of the United Nations recognise the state of Palestine as a sovereign state? Go on, just have a guess and I'll give you the answer after this.
James O'Brien on LBC.
10:49 is the time. I'm not sure how effective that was, actually, as an attempt at building up a little bit of suspense before giving you a surprise, because the top two suggestions of how many countries out of 193 UN member states recognise Palestine as a sovereign state, the top two answers are 4 and 169. Phil comes somewhere between the two with, I'm going to guess 15. I thought you'd guess low, but I kind of spoilt it by talking about how lonely we are on the international stage. If you'd asked me this question a couple of years ago and I hadn't been plugged into events and plugged into the stories, I would have presumed that we were very much of a piece with most comparable countries. So I'd have said out of 193, probably 40 or 50 recognise a Palestinian state. I mean, you'd count some Muslim countries as kind of a given, and some others perhaps with a history of their own occupation, their own colonial legacy. So you'd probably expect Ireland to be fairly high up on a list of countries that recognise Palestine as a sovereign state. The actual figure is 147 at the moment, and of course climbing and growing. It's a number to which the United Kingdom could be added at some point. And it is to matters in the United Kingdom that we return next. I mentioned Ballymena to you a little earlier. I used the word pogrom. I used it carefully and advisedly because people are being attacked for the perceived crime of having been born elsewhere in response to an alleged crime undertaken by two boys born in the same place. And, I talk about whiplash sometimes on the programme, metaphorical whiplash. News reports sometimes are delivered in such a sober fashion that you miss the heft of what is being reported. And I heard this morning that houses in Ballymena are now displaying flags and notices designed to convince racist rioters that the house does not contain any foreigners or any foreigners of a particular type, specifically Romanians. That's happening in the United Kingdom today. People sticking signs in their windows saying, please don't set fire to my house, I'm not Romanian. I'm trying to think which political figure it was on this side of the Irish Sea who was trying to incite hatred against Romanian neighbours not that long ago, but it's just eluding me for the moment. Allan Preston is a journalist in Belfast, ordinarily with the Irish News, but he has been in Ballymena and speaking to some of these families living in fear, but also, I think, Allan, not knowing where they're going to sleep tonight.
That's right, yes. I was in Ballymena yesterday morning after all these scenes of disorder emerged. I first travelled a few miles outside of Ballymena where there was a Filipino family. This was a man who's a night shift worker, and he received a call to say that his house was under attack where his wife and two children are. A petrol bomb was thrown into the backyard and a car went completely on fire, just very close to an oil tank. And he had to rush home quickly to see this happening. He's been living here 2 years. He works at the local bus factory. And now he's considering where he's going to live with his family. And shortly after that, I travelled into Ballymena town on the main street where all these riots were playing out over the last 2 nights. One house was completely destroyed in a fire. There was about 5 other houses that windows smashed. And one of the things that struck me looking in was that black wheelie bins were just thrown through windows and they were still lying on their sides in people's living room. I spoke to a brother and sister from Romania, but they've lived here half their lives, well over 10 years. And they were saying that they don't know where they're going to live now. They're going to stay with friends at the minute, and they're going to try and find somewhere else to stay. The brother said that when he heard about this alleged assault against the girl over the weekend, he wanted to get out and join the protests because people are outraged by this, rightly so. But he felt because he had a different skin color that, he might be in danger if he turned up to these protests. And obviously, after starting out initially peacefully on Monday night, they escalated into the scenes that we've seen. His sister has young children, and she mentioned to me how she went to the school gates to pick up her children, and she had a feeling that people were looking at her differently, as if she was tarred by this. She's associated with criminality. She's a full-time worker. She looks after her children, and now they're unsure where they're going to live.
I hope this isn't a silly question, Allan, and feel free to tell me if it is. But is the tinder in Ballymena drier than it is in other parts of the north of Ireland? I mean, is there anything about this community, this town, that lends itself to this sort of violence, historically or socially?
Ballymena, I suppose, is traditionally a manufacturing town. It's famous for having large factories over the years. Maybe it attracts a large workforce. You've got some political representatives in the area raising concerns about increased immigration into the area. So that is a feeling that, right or wrong, people are concerned about. But interestingly, we're hearing just this morning how sporadic this violence has been. The police at the moment don't believe that paramilitaries are coordinating this. They say they've talked about how social media can ferment hatred. Northern Ireland, of course, last year when we had the Stockport riots, that spread in Northern Ireland very strongly as well, in Belfast and other places. So we witnessed already last year how quickly these things can escalate, and in Ballymena certainly that was the case.
There's no dressing it up, is there, if a Filipino family is being petrol bombed? This is being seen by the masked men as opposed to the people mounting a peaceful visual for the victim of the alleged sexual assault. This is being seen as an opportunity for them to vent their xenophobic spleen, to attack people simply for being foreign. I don't think I didn't even realise that you had spoken to a Filipino family. I thought Filipinos were putting signs in their windows saying, "We're not Romanian."
Yes, that's what emerged this morning.
Oh, okay.
But the Filipino family that I spoke to, they live 4 miles away from where all these riots were kicking off. So I suspect that this was just an opportunity to attack them just because they were a different skin colour.
It's not going to end, is it? In the immediate future, I know the police are worried that this is going to become a frequent, if not a nightly, occurrence.
Yes, I heard a senior police officer this morning saying that police are prepared for more. They've got significant resources in place. They've already started reaching out to other police services across the UK. They discussed how they're gathering evidence, trying to identify people. The riots from last summer that I mentioned, people are starting to come through the courts. We're starting to see the fruit of those prosecutions. So certainly the police are on high alert.
And again, I hesitate to ask this question, but is anyone seeking to make political capital out of these events at the moment?
I suppose the MP in North Antrim, Jim Allister from the Traditional Unionist Voice, he had voiced concerns about immigration coming in. That had attracted some criticism from other political parties that maybe wasn't the right message to be sending out, although it has to be said he has condemned the violence as strongly as anybody else.
Allan Preston, journalist in Belfast with the Irish News, in Ballymena yesterday, but also in Cullybackey, 4 miles outside Ballymena, where, as he just told us, a Filipino family had a petrol bomb thrown into their property. I told you, didn't I, that it was a metaphorical whiplash, and I've now seen a photograph of that sign. That's why I got a little confused. A sign saying Filipino lives here, putting that in the glass thing above your front door, putting a sign there saying we're Filipino, and the subtext is we're not Romanian. Please don't firebomb our houses. And I'm still struggling to remember who it was in British politics who was inciting hatred against Romanian neighbours just a few years ago. I'm sure it'll come to me before the end of the programme. We'll keep an eye on that story as it develops. We'll probably should squeeze in George in Brentford for the final call on the sanctions visited upon these two hideous Israeli politicians. George, what made you pick up the phone?
Oh, hello. Thank you for taking my call. I picked up the phone because I agree with the sanctions against these two individuals. I speak as the son of a I can't put it really simple, a German Nazi member of the Nazi Party, and I'm not in any way saying the behaviour of Israel's like the Nazis. I don't like people who say that. Sure. But all my life growing up with this and talking with them, and the only thing I learned from all this is that sometimes you've got to stand up and call out something for what it is, even if it means you don't achieve it, that you achieve your aim. And I hear people like Suella Braverman and Preeti Patel, people I don't particularly like, saying, you want to maintain influence. But as far as I can see, and I understand that argument. Yes. It makes sense. And the British government's got lots of things to think about, like how to deal with the Americans, and they've got lots of other things to balance. But sometimes you have to call out something. You have to do what is right, regardless of the diplomatic repercussions, diplomatic connotations. Yeah, I'm afraid so. And, I'm going to be a little bit cheeky, but I have I haven't met anyone now who says that they were in favour of apartheid in the 80s. Suddenly everyone I knew, everyone says, they're all supported it. And I take your point. I mean that kind of historical revisionism is probably already underway, albeit unfortunately for some people they've done their cheerleading for Netanyahu and Smotrich and Ben-Gvir in public, as you've just reminded us, whether in the media or in politics. Thank you, George. A remarkable context, and I'm grateful to you for it. The time now is 11 o'clock.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It's 4 minutes after 11. We're going to do something a little different now. PMQs on the way at 12 o'clock, as usual on a Wednesday. But after that, it is time for the spending review. Rachel Reeves will be delivering her fiscal plans to the House of Commons, and we will take that live. Some early reports expecting £39 billion worth of social housing being announced under the Affordable Homes Programme to be spent over the next decade, and more defence. Probably the NHS will come out of this rather well. Anecdotally, and by that I mean my mum has got a lot of friends, and my mum's of an age where she has a lot of friends who are waiting for operations. But anecdotally, my mum tells me that they are actually getting appointments, and people are now feeling that the pipes are beginning to be unclogged in the NHS. Those are the two big things for Keir Starmer, aren't they? Immigration and the NHS are the things that he's kind of staking the government on. The immigration thing could prove tricky, but not least because there's one headline around today talking about alarm at plummeting immigration figures. Think about that in the context of A, what we just heard about Ballymena, and B, public discourse about immigration in this country since sort of Brexit unleashed the genie of respectable racism, if you can have such a thing. A country where the population is getting older and where we are prioritising the deterrence of younger people coming here to work while the birth rate of people already here continues to fall. You do not have to be Carol Vorderman to do that particular sum, or indeed Mr. Micawber. Result misery. And yet here we are, with the exception of the Lib Dems and the Greens, I suppose, but with most of the politicians in this country competing over who can sound the most disapproving of immigration levels. So it is set to plummet to pre-Brexit levels in the next year. That's according to the government's chief immigration advisor. Isn't that extraordinary? That plummeting to pre-Brexit levels would, for people who don't like immigration, be considered now a huge win. Whereas one of the major engines of Brexit was the idea that the levels were too high. And of course, that's a position you can only hold if you're either criminally stupid or deliberately ignoring basic demographics. It's a mad time that we live in. And the consequences, of course, of the kind of rhetoric that has now been allowed to go largely unchallenged in this country, the consequences being felt particularly keenly by that Filipino family in Northern Ireland last night, having a petrol bomb thrown into their home because they're foreign. On a night shift in a factory at the time, the head of the household. In fact, speaking of foreign-born heads of households, if you were to open the Daily Telegraph this morning, you'd read some more incitement against foreign-born heads of households. Apparently they're costing Britain about £3.6 billion a year in discounted rent. I never mention, do they, that the former Daily Telegraph columnist Boris Johnson is technically a foreign-born head of household, but there's no point blowing a racist dog whistle if you're going to start trying to undo its consequences before you've run out of puff. 7 after 11 is the time. It is to homelessness that I turn your attention next. Why is homelessness illegal? Do you know why homelessness is illegal? It's almost a question for Mystery Hour. Homelessness is illegal. How can homelessness be illegal? You used to hear people describe it as a lifestyle choice. Sort of contributors to certain types of radio phone-ins would call homelessness a lifestyle choice. You sort of sit there, if you're anything like me, and you think, how does that work then? How does it become a lifestyle choice? You're sitting at home watching the telly, and you think, do you know what? I don't like having a home. I don't want a home. I can conceive of being so hideously enslaved to a drug like heroin that you no longer pay your rent and eventually get evicted. And so your illness, your addiction has somehow delivered homelessness to you. But the idea of that as a lifestyle choice is absolutely extraordinary. And yet it is common among a certain type of right-wing rhetoric. It's sitting there watching the telly and you think to yourself, you turn to your partner and you say, do you fancy, should we sleep on the streets next year? Should we move out? It's a lifestyle choice, homelessness, you know. So should we make that choice, darling? Have you had enough of a roof? Roofs are overrated, aren't they? Roofs are overrated. Central heating? Curtains? Bricks? Bricks? Who needs bricks? Should we do that? Should we do that lifestyle choice thing and become homeless? I think, yeah, why not? I'm just going to go and tell the kids. It's extraordinary, the conversation around homelessness in this country. It became illegal in 1824 under the Vagrancy Act. Do you know why? Because so many people were rendered homeless by the Industrial Revolution. I'm not a historian, but I presume that the increased mechanisation of production meant that jobs were now, that were previously done by people, were now being done by machines, so that the person who owned the company and the machines would be able to make more money, because you don't have to pay a machine once you've bought it, it's yours, whereas you do have to pay a person. So human beings would have been rendered redundant in the workforce on such a scale that they lost their homes. Often homes, of course, that were owned by the same bloke that owned a factory that was now using machines to do the job that had once been done by you with your fingers. So homelessness became endemic in 1824 after the Industrial Revolution, and in order to imbue the authorities with the powers to move people along, they criminalised it. It was so that they could punish what were called in 1824, and are still probably called in the pages of the Daily Mail today, idle and disorderly persons and rogues and vagabonds. It was a combination, really, of the Napoleonic Wars and the Industrial Revolution. So you've lost your job because you've been replaced by a machine, or you've just come back from fighting in continental Europe for a king you've never met, or a queen, actually, in the case of 1824. But hey-ho, it's your fault you're homeless. And that was always the way, wasn't it? And I grew up thinking that. It's your fault you're homeless. I guess you have to do that in a society to keep the plebs under control. If you were to clock the fact that the system is so rigged and unfair that you can end up homeless through no fault of your own, in 1824 you can end up homeless as a consequence of the mechanisation of the factory that you used to work in, or you can come back from fighting for Queen and country and find that you've got nowhere to live. It must somehow be your fault. I don't think this is undergraduate. I think the fact that the phraseology of the Vagrancy Act contains the phrase idle and disorderly persons and rogues and vagabonds, it speaks to a political necessity to persuade the population that people are homeless through choice. People are homeless through choice. And that is the way that you keep the population in chains, isn't it? You kind of don't have to do anything as a society to address it. You don't have to acknowledge systemic inequality or unfairness, because to do so would be to utterly condemn the status quo. And you don't have to worry about the people who are homeless, because it's their fault that they are. It's extraordinary, isn't it? I see a lot of homeless people as a consequence of where I work more than where I live. There's a church and a homeless facility on the route that I take from the tube station to the train station to the office every morning. And it's impossible to generalise. I don't know why. Perhaps if I see a tidy-looking middle-aged woman with a suitcase queuing up outside the homeless facility near here, it probably hits me a little harder than it does when I see a dishevelled bloke who looks almost cadaverous in his physique. And then you see people who are clearly still taking enormous pains over their appearance and their presentation, and who would not look, quotes, homeless, end quotes, in a million years. This idea that we are talking about idle and disorderly persons and rogues and vagabonds is as true today in 2025 as it was 200 years ago in 1824. The public perception of homelessness being, I think, deliberately fomented to keep the problem away from the rest of us. So I'm going to do something weird now. Okay, and we're talking about it because Angela Rayner has secured a governmental agreement on the necessity of dropping this law. Rough sleeping is to be decriminalised. I don't know what that will mean in the great scheme of things, but it will mean most obviously that if you're sleeping on a pavement, you're not automatically breaking the law. It may mean that we see again the kind of camps. You know, when I moved to London in 1991, Lincoln's Inn Field, I've told you this before, haven't I? But I still find it hard to believe. There's two things have happened in my life that I sort of think I might have been dreaming. One happened in Medjugorje in the former Yugoslavia, when I was given an ultimatum at school. I'd either have to go on pilgrimage during half term to a little town where 6 children said that they'd seen the Virgin Mary. The Virgin Mary had appeared to them in visions. I'd either go on pilgrimage during half term or I was going to get suspended for an offence I can't even remember. I didn't want to tell my parents that I'd got into trouble, so I had to pretend to them that I'd developed this deep desire to go on a pilgrimage. And I was in that town one night, and I'd had a few Pivos. Serbo cry out for beer, Keith. I'd had a few Pivos, but my mate Ben and I decided to try the door of the church. And we went in to the church, and there was a lot of candlelight, and because I was with someone else, I know that I didn't dream it. And the church appeared to be full of homeless people. A lot of people who appeared very dishevelled were sitting in the church. And so we lit a candle, said a prayer. I think I fell asleep, I'm afraid, somewhat embarrassingly. And then we went back to our digs, and we mentioned it the next morning to one of the priests who was running our group, and he didn't know what we were talking about. So we started asking a few other people, and nobody knew. And we went back the next night, and the church was locked. It's one of the only kind of vaguely supernatural things that's ever happened to me. We ended up asking pretty much everybody involved in the trip, who were the priests that ran the church, the locals that we were staying with. Nobody knew anything about the idea of the church being open at night and containing people who appeared to be homeless. And the other thing that I look back on and think, did that really happen? Was literally when I first moved to London. And Lincoln's Inn Field, which is now an incredibly sort of salubrious and leafy enclave near the Temple. It's where the lawyers hang out at Lincoln's Inn. It was one of the inns of court. It was a shanty town when I was at the London School of Economics, which was just around the corner. I mean, literally a shanty town. People were living in dwellings made of pallets. Not just tents, but also sort of semi-permanent bivouacs, home-built shelters. And on a sufficient scale that it was a town. It was a mini community, a village, a shanty village, call it what you will. Incredible, right? Incredible. So the idea that there's a worry we may see people setting up homeless camps as a consequence of dropping this law is to completely ignore what actually happened when Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister. I'm going to ask you how easy it is to end up homeless. I've probably gone on a bit too long in this introduction. I know I make a lot of jokes about that all the time, but I'm going to wait and see whether or not you're already ready to give me a ring and answer that question, because I know that it could happen to almost anyone. It just informs my view of the world. Martin Amis had a thing called tramp angst, in that some people can conceive of ending up on a bench, and some people cannot. My wife cannot. I can. I can conceive of, in the dark hours, 4:00 in the morning, running out of everything, doing something so unspeakably stupid that all my usual places of refuge or recourse would be denied to me, ending up in so much bother that you are actually homeless. I get it, but it's psychological. It's never going to happen, he says, and then almost crosses himself. It's never going to happen, jinx. But I think it could. And for an awful lot of other people are, of course, the opposite. So I want to know how easy it is. 0345 606 0973. And I want you to know that when it comes to the people who say it's a lifestyle choice, or it's your fault, or it is simply a mark of being idle and disorderly and rogues and vagabonds, I want you to know that I've got your back on this. Again, perhaps a position not that common in the UK media, but the notion that people end up homeless through anything other than misfortune seems to me to be pretty hideous. So let's find out how easy it is to end up homeless in the United Kingdom in 2025. It's 11:18.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 11:19. That's touched a nerve. It's such a strange thing that you either have or you don't have. I wonder how many people who've ended up homeless didn't have it. Do you see what I mean? There was a story a couple of years ago, and it was about a broadcaster. And that's, I suppose, why it sort of stung a little. I read about a bloke that used to be on the telly, and I think the radio as well, and who ended up sleeping on a park bench in I think, Brighton, somewhere on the south coast. And it just resonates with some of us in a way that it doesn't with others. You either have it or you don't. The reason I mentioned Martin Amis, one of my favourite writers, is because he was best mates for years with another of my favourite writers, Julian Barnes. And I'm pretty sure I didn't imagine this. He would describe how he had it and his mate didn't. Despite the fact that they were, similarly successful and they were both financially secure, he still had it and his mate didn't. It's the same as my marriage. I have it and my wife doesn't. It's so strange. I wonder if it ever goes away. But it's built upon the idea that it must be quite easy to lose your home. It must be quite easy to end up homeless. And that is completely at odds with 200 years of government-sanctioned propaganda. Not only is it impossible to end up homeless if you're not a vagabond or a ne'er-do-well, but it's absolutely right that if you do, if you dare to put your head down anywhere, you automatically commit a crime. Wow. Oliver's in Deptford. Oliver, what would you like to say?
Hi, yeah, I just wanted to reinforce what you were saying about how easy it is to become homeless. I was made homeless almost overnight after my landlord hiked the rent by 80% when our tenancy came to an end, and none of us could afford to stay in the house, so we had to move out, and I was made homeless immediately. What?
I mean, forgive me for the crassness of my questions, but I mean, you simply couldn't find anywhere else to live that you could afford.
Yeah, basically, everywhere in the area. At the time, I was in Nunhead, so it's quite a nice area of London. So I couldn't find anywhere there, and because of the last-minute nature, I was left to kind of very quickly try and find somewhere, and I wasn't able to. My friends managed to find a couple places, but I wasn't in a position where I could afford a deposit in my own place.
Right.
I was in a house share.
So where did you go?
So I was lucky enough to have a studio for my work, where I was managed to just sleep in the studio floor and like avoid the night security.
So you were hiding, effectively?
Yeah, basically, yeah.
How long did... I've got a friend that happened to, actually. I'd completely forgotten. How long did that go on for?
6 months. 6 months, and then I managed to get a place in Deptford, which I was very lucky to find with some friends.
So if you hadn't had that job, or you hadn't had that studio, do you know where you would have gone?
No, I probably would have started squatting.
Yeah.
Which is, I don't know if you've ever squatted, but it's not very fun anymore.
The only time I've been in squats, it was during a time when it was quite fun, which was sort of in the early 90s in Camden.
I've heard stories.
Yes. Well, don't make me feel that old, mate. But that kind of jeopardy that you find yourself in is it something you'd ever contemplated before, or were you sort of pinching yourself to wonder, how the heck have I ended up in this situation?
Yeah. Well, I thought I'd done it pretty well. I'd done my apprenticeship, finished my apprenticeship. I was pretty. I like a pint, but I was pretty screwed on. Sure. I wasn't doing anything silly, and I just managed to find myself, despite having a very good job, or what I think is a very good job, just forced into homelessness for about 6 months. And the council offered me temporary accommodation in Kent,
right,
which I wasn't willing to move to because it would have made my commute about 2.5 hours.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if you didn't have any roof at all over your head, you'd have had to take that offer, wouldn't you?
Well, yeah, exactly. I was very fortunate to be able to stay in my studio.
It's amazing, isn't it, how you'd use the word fortunate in the context of what you're discussing. But I know exactly why you're using that word, and I know exactly what you mean. It can be that simple. That's something else the government is doing. I know we spend a lot of time giving them a kicking, but addressing the hideousness of no-fault evictions is on their list as well. So when you couple the fact that if you do end up on the streets, you'll no longer be a criminal, with the fact that landlords will not have or have already lost the right, I can't remember which, to do what was done to Oliver, then something else you might chalk up as progress. But I suppose it's not something that's going to get celebrated in the pages of the Daily Mail anytime soon. Speaking of the Daily Mail, there's an extraordinary little aside today by one of their columnists, very, very cross about Sir Sadiq Khan getting knighted yesterday. I don't know if you saw this. So there's a columnist called Sarah Vine, whose former husband Michael Gove is now in the House of Lords. I know. I'm sorry if you didn't know that. But she has decided to take aim at the Mayor of London by asking, let me get this question absolutely right, was there ever anyone less deserving of a knighthood than Sadiq Khan? Well, I mean, I don't want to turn this into a parlour game, but off the top of my head, I was thinking maybe Jimmy Savile? No? Okay. Robert Mugabe? Anybody? More deserving of a knighthood than Sadiq Khan? Elected Mayor of London, of course, 3 times. This is, of course, the former wife of Michael Gove, who's been put in the House of Lords for services to Breaking Britain. But, hey, I mean, we could go on. Fred Goodwin? remember him? Fred the Shred, they called him, former chief executive of the Royal Bank of Scotland. Essentially for his contribution to the biggest financial meltdown in living memory, which led to the biggest recession since 1945. He got a knighthood. He had it taken away. But no, if you're a columnist in the Daily Mail, I wonder what it is about Sadiq Khan that upsets these people so much. Was there ever anyone less deserving of a knighthood than Sir Sadiq Khan? Well, Jimmy Savile, Fred Goodwin, Nicolae Ceausescu, the former Romanian dictator. He got knighted, but hey-ho, at least he didn't bring in a ULEZ zone in Budapest, in Romania. And I guess the final one, actually some of them are a bit obscure, but those are my favourites. And Gavin Williamson, didn't he get a knighthood as well? But hey-ho, if you're a Daily Mail columnist, it's Sadiq Khan who is at the bottom of this list that contains Jimmy Savile, Fred Goodwin, Nicolae Ceausescu and Robert Mugabe. 26 minutes after 11 is the time. Back to the question of homelessness. Charlie is in Nottingham. Charlie, what made you pick up the phone?
I think it's really important that people realise that it is so easy to become homeless, even when you have a successful job. I served in the Royal Navy, and when I came out, when I finished, I lost my naval accommodation. I found a place to stay. I got a job. But then depression and family issues, it just became a spiral. But people wouldn't have known I was homeless. I showered every day. I kept myself clean. I tried to have that self-respect. But it is so easy to just let things spiral out of control without having any addictions, without being an alcoholic, without taking drugs. I did neither of those things. And I still ended up homeless.
What can we pick through the process? Would that be okay?
Yeah.
This is sort of I suppose the most obvious pivot is when you closed the door behind you for the final time and didn't have another door to go through.
For me, it was having those problems with family who couldn't understand why I was going through depression, who couldn't understand that I wasn't okay.
Yeah.
And who thought that the problem was with me, coming from a family that doesn't really put much stock in mental health.
You were an idle and disorderly person in the mind.
Kind of, yeah. Even though I'd served, even though I'd done everything right, I had a house, I had a life. But once I stopped serving and once I stopped providing for myself, they thought, yeah, you're less than you, and they just couldn't understand that.
So you were alone. I mean, that's going to be quite a big part of it. And the people to whom you might have turned for help, you partly because of your mental health and partly because of their attitudes, you felt that you couldn't. When did you first sleep under the stars? I mean, did you sleep under the stars, as it were?
For 19 months.
19 months.
19 months.
What was the first night like?
In a tunnel. Leading off from the Tower of London.
Yeah.
And scary. Not wanting to fall asleep in case I was beaten up or what little things I had were stolen. Yeah. But just weary and exhausted and just at rock bottom, not knowing what to do, where to go. And it even took me a long time to even go to a homeless shelter to ask for help because I didn't want to admit things were that bad. And it took me a long time. I got myself sorted. I now have a career. Right. I now have a house and I have a family.
Good.
But it took a long time.
It's lonely.
It was just...
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot going on, isn't there? And what you describe is going... Did you ever think it could happen to you? Do you recognise that tramp angst that I talked about? No, you didn't have that.
I didn't think it...
Go on.
When I was young and I had my whole life planned, I was going to serve, I was going to have that house, I was going to have the 2.4 kids, I was going to be the person I always wanted to be. And I was so sure of my own ability that I didn't think it could be that bad. And then when things happened, it wasn't until I really spiraled and I was sat in the middle of the night one night and someone tried to do something unsavory. I thought, life has got so low, you need to you need to get your head up now and do something. And that's when I sought help. And that's when things started to get better. Like for 19 months, I didn't claim benefits. I didn't do anything.
It just fell through the cracks completely. I mean, the depression is the driving engine here, isn't it? It's just that it's not even self-loathing, because that's got an almost rational basis to it. It's a combination of...
I wasn't doing anything. I just allowed the depression. It will sound crazy, but the depression, it became like a warm, fuzzy blanket. And when I was given the choice of getting better, that was the scary part, not the homeless part. The scary part was actually taking that first step and saying, I need help.
So you were alive but not living, as it were.
The depression was safe.
Yeah, okay.
Living was the scary part.
Wow. And that explains why you... No, it makes absolutely perfect sense. You've explained it brilliantly. And that failure to seek help, reluctance to seek help, makes sense as well, because from the outside, that would be the really tricky bit to understand. But
when you spoke about your train journey going into work each day, every day I kept my membership up at the gym, and I showered every day. I had clean clothes every day, because the one thing I was taught was you've got to look presentable. And that was the only thing I maintained, was how clean I was and how well I looked. So people didn't see someone that needed help. So I became more invisible.
Of course. I hadn't thought of it that way around. And did you ever come into the interests of the authorities? I don't know why I just sounded like a Victorian school teacher.
No, not really. But I remember the first time I went to a soup kitchen.
Right.
The lady was actually reluctant to give me something because I was so well dressed.
Got it.
I was clean shaven. I smelled okay. I presented as a person that was okay. And then I had to explain that I didn't drink, I didn't smoke, didn't take drugs, but I was still homeless. And she actually said to me, she said, you are a unicorn, you're rare. No one comes here that doesn't smoke or drink or have drugs.
That idea. I mean, how long ago was this, if you don't mind me asking?
This was in the 90s.
Yeah, I was going to say, because
late 90s.
That probably wouldn't apply now, because certainly anecdotally, except I'm the anecdote, but I see people outside the facility near here who, for want of a better word, look completely respectable, as you would describe yourself, and all sort of demographics are represented there. But yeah, I guess it's one of those things that goes cyclically, isn't it? So the late 90s may have been an era where falling through the cracks would be a consequence of addiction and similar, but not someone whose mental health was just about good enough to keep things together physically in terms of appearance, but obviously in catastrophic circumstances when it came to the need for seeking out the help you so obviously deserved. Thank you, mate. Thank you, Charlie. It's 11:33. Thomas Watts has your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC.
11:36 is the time. We should do a sort of corrections and clarifications on the programme, shouldn't we? I got that wrong. I don't know why in my head I thought Victoria would have been on the throne in 1824. It was George IV. But Victoria, quite a few of you reminded me, didn't come to the throne until, I think, 1837, maybe? Richard's in central France, he tells me. So so George IV dropped off this mortal coil in 1830. Who came between George IV and Victoria? It was another son of George III, wasn't it? It was George IV's brother. Was it a William? Was there a King William in 1840? I think there was a William. I haven't looked it up. No, why are you suggesting that? I reckon there was a William. I think there was a William, 1840 to 1847. My mum could tell me. My mum can do it all, from William the Conqueror onwards, right through to the current fella, Charles. But anyway, we digress. Homelessness and the ease with which you can fall into or fall through the cracks. Kaz is in Ross-on-Wye, lovely part of the world. Kaz, what would you like to say?
Morning, James. First time caller to your show, but I'm a little bit nervous.
It's only me.
Yeah, so I'm a single mum and I'm self-employed. I've got one 15, now he's 15, year old son. I'm also a lone parent, as his dad passed away in 2018.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. And so we ended up at classed as one of the hidden homeless, I suppose, because we were in temporary accommodation for 10 months. So we were served a Section 21 notice in November 22 by a really lovely landlord
Is that sarcasm?
No, not at all.
No, I was just literally just checking, but they needed the property back, and
yeah, well, they just wanted to sell because the interest rates had gone so crazy. It was their pension pot.
Oh, it was Liz Truss.
Yeah.
Okay.
The Truss effect,
yes.
Definitely was. Yeah, so they had to sell up just because it wasn't viable for them anymore. They just kept the rent really low for me. I was there for 8 years. They respected me as a tenant, and I respected them as landlords.
Oh dear.
But they were just left with no choice, really, other than to sell up. So I started looking around at properties, and in the 8 years that we'd been in that property, the rent had just gone sky high.
Yeah.
And so as a single income household and a low income, there was just no way I could do it.
What do we know? What would it? So you present yourself to the council, and they put you up in temporary accommodation. Tell me a bit about the. Carry on.
First of all, they told me to stay there, and that's what they tell people. They tell you to stay after your tenancy is finished.
Oh, don't move out.
And for the landlord to take you to court.
Right. Because the alternative is homelessness.
Yeah. So the alternative is they have to house you. They tell you that they might send you out of county. So they try and completely scare you off.
Yeah.
But I sort of stood my ground. I said, well, can you make me do that? I said, can you actually make me stay in the property? And they were like, no, actually we can't.
And this is why your relationship with the landlord was relevant, because you didn't want to...
Well, yeah. So then they tried to make me stay after the tenancy had finished. Even they'd lined up temporary, but they were like, oh, it might not happen actually on that day. And I said, the thing is, he gave me 6 months notice, which was much more than he needed to.
Yes.
He's been a more than reasonable landlord, and I'm not prepared to stay after that time because he's taken a week off work. He wants to do up the property and get it straight on the market.
You're such a sweeheart. We're a funny old species, aren't we, Kaz? I mean,
they were lovely.
That's what I mean. That's a remarkable.
But they put my rent down during COVID.
Right.
They got in touch with me. They knew, because I'm a self-employed photographer, and they knew that during COVID, all my weddings and everything were cancelled.
I get it. I understand why you did what you did and why you felt how you felt. But it is, and then when push came to shove, you weren't going to stay, and they find you temporary accommodation?
So they found me a one-bed flat in the centre of Ross, which was above a bookmaker's, incredibly noisy at night. So I was in one bed with my son. But then we were still... So I thought once we moved in there that was it. I would be classed as priority. But no, you're not. You've got to be in temporary accommodation for a further 56 days. And then you're classed as priority. But we were actually in that flat for 10 months, and it was completely unsuitable. It was damp and really cold, completely unsuitable. We finally, thankfully, last January, we got a housing association, which is in a lovely area just outside Ross, and couldn't be happier. Finally, we've got our sort of forever home almost. But yeah,
and. I don't know why I'm asking everyone this question, but did you think it could ever happen to you? Did you think it was? I mean, did you live? No.
I work hard. I've got my head pretty screwed on. No, not at all.
And there it is. That crack just opens up in front of you, and you fall through it. If you hadn't had your son, what would have happened? Do you know?
I probably would have ended up on the street.
Well, there it is.
It's not as easy. It's nowhere near as easy to actually get anywhere if you haven't got a child. I know my friend of mine's sister had to just stay put. She had to do what the council told her and stay put and get taken to court. And that's
that, of
what
course,
the councils are telling people because they don't have the temporary accommodation.
I mean, it's a vicious circle because, as Andy reminds us, that will make it pretty much impossible to rent anything ever again because your previous landlord didn't leave on your record, so to speak, or you're certainly not going to get a reference.
But that's what people are being forced to do because they're just told, well, there is no temporary accommodation. We have nowhere to put you.
Wow, and you're all right now.
Yeah, we're fine. We're good.
Thank you, Kaz. It's an incredible story, and as with all the calls this hour, really driving home the fact that it can happen to pretty much anybody. You're quite amused as well at the same time by the Daily Mail columnist wondering whether anyone has ever deserved a knighthood less than Sir Sadiq Khan. I thought you'd made this up. Benito Mussolini Admittedly, Daily Mail owners at the time were quite big fans of him, but I don't know if that applies to latter-day columnists. Benito Mussolini got a knighthood. Oswald Mosley didn't. He was Sir Oswald Mosley, but that was hereditary, I think. He was the son of, or a grandson of a Lord High Panjandrum. But yeah, Benito Mussolini's on the list. So has anyone ever deserved a knighthood less than Sadiq Khan? So we've got Jimmy Savile, Fred Goodwin, Nicolae Ceausescu, Bucharest, of course, being the capital of Romania. Another correction and clarification, not Budapest. Robert Mugabe, probably my favourite. I don't know why. And Benito Mussolini. Others who've received similar gongs, of course, include Gavin Williamson and Andrea Leadsom. I don't mind sports. Philip says this is a personal gripe. Lewis Hamilton, Andy Murray and David Beckham. I don't mind knighting sports people. They bring us a lot of joy, which is not something anyone has ever said about Michael Gove, who got an actual peerage for services to something. It's coming up to 11:45. That's probably it for the homelessness conversation, but it's one to which we will return. I have Simon Marks joining me shortly. We may have, and then of course PMQs, and then the spending review. I was going to do a missed information today, but we may be overtaken by time, which means you need to remind me to do a missed information tomorrow. I also had 2 missing word headlines this week, which I completely forgot about. So I've come back from holiday, and sometimes I have a week off and I come back all professional. It hasn't happened this time.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It's 11:47 and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Let me just run you through the timetable for what is left of this morning and the first hour of this afternoon. Simon Marks joins me imminently to discuss the unfolding situation in Los Angeles and beyond. After that, Natasha Clark will join me to set up this week's PMQs, after which PMQs will unfold, after which after which Natasha and I will pick over the bones of the aforementioned PMQs, after which Rachel Reeves will get to her feet in the House of Commons and deliver her spending review, at which point I might leg it. It depends on what Sheila's up to, but hopefully she'll slide into the studio. Asma, isn't it, today? Of course, Sheila's away. So Asma in for Sheila. She'll slide into the studio and I'll slide out without affecting my remuneration for this morning's efforts. So that's good news for everybody, isn't it? It's a little bit David Brent, perhaps. But I'm sure you'll join me in being delighted with an early finish. Simon Marks is in Washington, D.C., LBC's US editor. I almost dread to ask, Simon, but what's the latest?
Well, the latest, James, is that we are, I think, on the verge of seeing a pretty substantial expansion of Donald Trump's determination to flood the streets of cities all over the country with federal law enforcement agents, as he threatens to, in his words, liberate Los Angeles, a city that hasn't actually been seized. Very small pockets of Los Angeles, of course, are still facing substantial numbers of protesters who don't like Donald Trump's mass deportation policies and who are determined to continue demonstrating against them. There was a curfew put in place by the mayor of Los Angeles, Karen Bass, again in small pockets of the city. Last night from 8 o'clock in the evening local time, police, National Guard and other law enforcement agents were involved in various scuffles with protesters trying to enforce that curfew overnight. But it was a relatively quiet night in Los Angeles for the second night running. And what we are seeing on a daily basis here is an inverse response to relative calm by the President of the United States, who looks at a situation and says that he believes that Los Angeles is now coming under assault by a foreign enemy. Wow. And that language is really important because under the terms of the law, Trump supporters claim that he can invoke the 1807 Insurrection Act, which he hasn't quite done yet, if he deems that the country is coming under attack by a foreign enemy. And by insisting that these protesters, and they are not now only in Los Angeles, they also took to the streets last night in Atlanta, in New York, in Chicago. These protests are now spreading as a direct consequence of Donald Trump's overheated response to them. by claiming that America is coming under attack by a foreign enemy, he definitely appears to be laying the groundwork to invoke the 1807 Insurrection Act, which would be the point at which he can deploy members of the US Armed Forces. The Marine Corps will already be on the streets of Los Angeles today. He can deploy the men and women in uniform who are supposed to only have duties outside this country, fighting America's enemies there. He can deploy them, he will argue, on the streets of America as well.
And they, of course, took an oath to the Constitution, not to the president or to any politician.
Yeah, they did, but I don't see yet very much pushback coming from the ranks of the armed forces. And remember, at senior levels, Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary, has purged many of the top generals within the armed forces that don't share Donald Trump's worldview. So, I mean, one of the more bizarre images that we witnessed yesterday were aerial shots of a baseball field in Los Angeles, looked like a high school baseball diamond, where the Marines were training. They were being trained in how to bring protesters under control. Because, of course, that's not part of what the Marines are supposed to do. You've now got more members of the US Army and the Marine Corps, infantry brigades as well, deployed on American streets than you've got deployed in Iraq, Afghanistan or Syria.
I think Hegseth had misled people on that one, hadn't he, by claiming that they were trained and ready previously. But that, I mean...
Yes, absolutely, yes.
I mean, crikey.
And also obfuscated about what all of this was costing in a very contentious hearing with the Budget Committee in the House of Representatives yesterday. They've now finally conceded that so far just sending the Marines to Los Angeles is costing them $143 million. Bear in mind also that the martial images that we've seen include pictures of train loads of tanks and howitzers and armoured personnel carriers coming here to Washington for Donald Trump's big birthday parade on Saturday. It's officially to mark the 250th anniversary of the creation of the formation of the US Army. Happens to be on Donald Trump's birthday. But those images were accompanied yesterday by a threat from the President of the United States that any demonstrators, any protesters who take to the streets of Washington to register any objection to that $45 million event will also be immediately rounded up and arrested.
I mean, that's First Amendment territory, because that would include, I saw those comments and they were, characteristically incoherent, but what was coherent was the threat to peaceful protesters being punished, being sanctioned.
Yeah. Absolutely, but he characterises all protesters now, certainly in Los Angeles, as criminal aliens and migrants.
But people
and
can see that they're not
protesters.
I mean, I don't want to trivialise it, but I'm reminded of when he claimed they were eating the cats and eating the dogs, and they couldn't find anybody to confirm that. People can see that these are not aliens or foreigners conducting and yet he persists with the lie.
Well, he persists with the lie, aided by a pliant media. Some of the protesters in Los Angeles are waving Mexican flags, large Mexican banners. Those images are being played on a loop by networks like Fox News, by the right-leaning streaming channels here that do Donald Trump's bidding on a daily basis. So they are helping to underscore his alternative fact that all of these demonstrators are criminal aliens. Are some of them criminal aliens? Yeah, probably. But there are also lots of American citizens who don't like the fact that these mass deportations are taking place, don't like the manner in which they are taking place, and really worry now that Donald Trump is putting this country on the fast track to becoming a police state.
Well, and what does that mean? I mean, some people think, I can't remember whether we've had this conversation, that it may be a precursor to trying to swerve the midterms. What's the goal, do you think? And we now are in the realms of opinion rather than reportage.
Well, I think that there is no question that should he invoke the 1807 Insurrection Act And should he succeed in deploying all of these troops across the country, and NBC News was reporting last night they now have plans to send troops to tactical units of ICE, the Immigration, Customs and Enforcement Division, to 5 more cities across the country. This is, one can argue that this is designed to create so much tumult in American society, foment violence in towns and cities all over the country, create circumstances that would potentially allow Donald Trump at some point to say, I have to declare a state of emergency now, and I'm really sorry. We may even have to suspend various parts of the Constitution, and those midterm elections in November of 2026, I just don't know if we're going to be able to do them under these circumstances in which the country is coming under an assault by alien criminals, a foreign enemy. I mean, there is definitely that possibility coming. He may not do that now. He may not even be thinking yet about doing that now, but it is absolutely a series of possibilities that one cannot rule out, given the seeming determination of the President of the United States to confront these protesters with muscle that absolutely is in inverse proportion, despite the appalling images that we've seen of protesters dropping cinder blocks on police cars in small pockets of Los Angeles. The response: thousands of members of the National Guard deployed, the Marines standing by, infantry brigades being dispatched to Los Angeles. The response is in inverse proportion to what has actually been taking place.
And probably, I mean, I always wonder whether we need reminding, but it doesn't do any harm to remember his response to the January the 6th riots, when, of course, a murderous mob of his supporters were baying for the blood of his own vice president. They've subsequently been pardoned and praised by Donald Trump for undertaking behaviours at least as bad and at least as violent as the small pockets of rioting that you described. No one's died yet, have they, Simon, in this?
No one has died.
Well, there's another
yet,
difference
with
between...
the emphasis.
Yes,
with the
of course,
emphasis
but
on
another
the
difference
yet,
between that and January the 6th. Final question, and be brief if you would, because PMQs is about to start. Where's the pushback coming from?
Well, the pushback's coming from Governor Gavin Newsom, the Democratic governor of California, who made an address to the state last night in prime time. But in reality, it was an address to the nation, in which he absolutely accused Trump of a brazen abuse of power, saying that he was bringing a wrecking ball to American democracy, insisted that he's taking legal action to try and get these armed forces off the streets of the city. But what he was really doing was laying claim to leadership within the Democratic Party. He wants to be the Democrats' 2028 presidential nominee, and he's not going to stand by and watch Trump destroy those aspirations.
Simon Marks, thank you. There was a Nazi philosopher, or at least a German jurist who joined the Nazi Party. Of course, you had to at that time in history, called Carl Schmitt, who coined the phrase state of exception, which is when a sovereign transcends the rule of law by, often by inventing a crisis. And I think we're very, very squarely in that kind of territory here, as Simon has just brilliantly explained. But don't forget, it's Zelensky, it's Volodymyr Zelensky, Alex reminds us, who is the real dictator here, even as Trump tries to potentially do exactly what he accused Zelensky of doing when Zelensky hadn't. Natasha Clark is here, PMQs today. I hear Kemi Badenoch has been telling people she's doing a great job.
Yes, I've just got this article ready on my screen.
From Matt Ford's.
Yes, she told Matt Ford yesterday when she took part in his political party at the Duchess Theatre last night. She talked about Prime Minister's questions. She says that she needs to channel her inner dame. I realise this isn't a courtroom where I'm prosecuting a witness.
What sort of dame? A pantomime dame?
Exactly. Right. I'm prosecuting a witness. It's a pantomime. And yeah, I wanted to discuss this with you because I thought you might have some thoughts on how Kemi Badenoch is performing so far.
According to Kemi Badenoch, very well. What do you think? What brilliance can we look forward to today?
Well, obviously, it's the one before the spending review, so it's always quite hard to predict exactly where these politicians are going to go. And there's quite a lot of things to go through. Probably the unemployment figures is where I thought that she might start today. She has been talking in the papers today about the family farm tax. That's something, of course, that the Conservatives have been really pushing. Is there going to be more money for farmers in the spending review that's going to help them push their sort of idea that we shouldn't be that we should be helping the farmers to get some of that money back. That's one idea. Of course, as well, the wild card option, I think, Israel. Yesterday, the UK decision to sanction those 2 ministers got quite a lot of reaction from the Labour backbenchers, but the Conservatives are a little bit more cautious about whether they think that is the right course of action. Some people saying we shouldn't be sanctioning ministers in governments of our allies.
I don't mean to do a
gossip. Some Conservative MPs.
I heard Andrew Mitchell, I think, saying that it was the right thing to do to sanction these 2.
Yes, that is correct. Some Conservatives are supporting it. Some say that actually this is not going to help us end the war, that this is not going to help us get to a peace deal.
Who was it that had a secret meeting with members of the Israeli government in direct contravention of the ministerial code and was therefore forced to resign?
Can you remind me of that one? I guess, is it pretty
and what's her job at the moment?
Shadow Foreign Secretary.
Good Lord. There's no obstacle to advancement in Kemi Badenoch's party.
It's true.
I just, while I have you, or rather, while it's in my mind, we were laughing earlier at a Daily Mail columnist suggesting that Sadiq Khan was a less deserving recipient of a knighthood than Jimmy Savile, Robert Mugabe, Nicolae Ceausescu, Fred Goodwin and Benito Mussolini. But Michelle Mone is in the news today. The High Court will begin hearing the government's multi-million-pound legal claim against the company awarded 2 massive PPE contracts during the pandemic after she recommended it to ministers. So there's someone else in receipt of a major honour who, in the eyes of Sarah Vine, would be more deserving perhaps than Sir Sadiq Khan. So is that it? Is that what we're expecting? And then, as you say, the spending review, how long does that normally take?
It's going to be about 45 minutes to an hour of Rachel Reeves setting out the spending review. Of course, the government and Kemi Badenoch could press them on the spending review, but she's got plenty of opportunities, and Mel Stride has quite a lot of time to speak afterwards. So I imagine she might talk about other topics. Another thing that the Conservatives are trying to press them on is numbers of teachers. That could be something that might come up. The government says they want to recruit more, but if you go onto the government website and you look at how many more teachers there were since they came into government last year, the numbers are actually down. We are told that the government wants to prioritise schools and teachers in this upcoming spending review. The devil will be in the detail about whether there is actually going to be more money for schools, whether they've got enough to give them more pay rises, as the unions, of course, are asking for, and actually grow teacher numbers. And, we saw with the last government trying to grow police numbers. It's incredibly difficult when so many people are leaving the profession, not just in the police, but, of course, in teachers as well. So that might be something that Kemi Badenoch might try to push them on as well.
Sometimes I need to pause and wonder why people are sending me the messages that they're sending me. So about 50 people have sent me the words Jacob Rees and Mogg in the last 20 minutes, but of course he got a knighthood as well. So that will be why that is there. We are now waiting for Kemi Badenoch to get to her feet. Anything on the nuclear stuff? Anything on Sizewell C, do you think?
I don't think it's a really contentious issue anymore. It probably was 10, 20, 30 years ago, the idea about nuclear and whether we do want it to be built in our backyard. But governments of all colours now have backed it. I'm old enough to remember being at Sizewell C when Boris Johnson announced more money for it just a couple of years ago on one of his last speeches as Prime Minister. Like, every single government seems to back the idea of nuclear. This is a lot of public money, however, spending around £14 billion, putting that into that project to try and get investment, to try and get other businesses to try and back it. But yeah, I don't think it's really a contentious one. It's not really something that there's any difference in the parties, really, I don't think. So probably not.
So it's a case of wait and see pie now. And what happens after the spending review? The Shadow Chancellor responds and we all fall asleep.
Yeah, basically, yes. No, you listen to LBC where I'll tell you. I will tell you all of the very important bits in it that you might have missed while Rachel Reeves was speaking. Yes, and Mel Stride will respond for the opposition, and then we will be getting all the details and all the documents and trying to dive into that to find out where those cuts are, because it's not really just about the spending that Rachel Reeves is announcing today. It's where the cuts are going to come from. She's warned us for months this is going to be a really tough spending round, and we haven't had a proper one of these since 2015, thanks to Brexit, thanks to COVID, thanks to the pandemic, all of these other reasons, which is why there was no full 3-year spending review. So it has been a while before we've had these government budgets allocated in this way. And it does matter to people on the ground, because this is the money that's being spent on schools, on hospitals, on transport. You're going to hear a lot from the government about where they are spending the money today. But, I'm going to be looking later to try and find out in all of the books and the documents where the cuts are going to come.
And a question I should ask you every Wednesday, what do you think Ed Davey might go in on?
Is it too predictable to say, will he give more money for care homes to create a proper social care plan, or
Israel
on Gaza?
As well?
Yeah.
He may, if Badenoch doesn't go there, Davey may go there from a slightly different angle.
Definitely.
As in you could go further.
And obviously you've just been hearing about those reports from Simon Markson in the States about what Donald Trump is up to.
Let's find out.
Mr. Speaker, perhaps the Prime Minister knows something I don't know. There's only one hospital in my constituency. But Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, since Labour took office, Mr. Speaker, inflation has nearly doubled, growth has halved, and unemployment has surged. Is this what the Prime Minister meant when he tweeted that the economy is improving?
Minister. Mr. Speaker, since the general election, 500,000 more people are in work. And I know she doesn't mention that. She's fixated on talking Britain down. We're investing in the future. Mr. Speaker, even in the last 2 weeks, the Strategic Defence Review, 30,000 new jobs building submarines. Yesterday, the Sizewell announcement, 10,000 new jobs. Tens of thousands of construction jobs building the social and affordable housing that was announced this morning. That's the difference that Labour makes in government.
Mr. Speaker, he must be talking about a different economy. All of us in this House heard about unemployment increasing. Unemployment has increased every month since Labour took office. Last year, he said he was taking the winter fuel payment away to balance the books. But the books are not balanced. In fact, they are worse. This year, the deficit is forecast to be £10 billion higher since the budget. Not since last year's election, since the budget. In what way are the books now balanced?
Mr. Speaker, she's obviously missed the interest rate cuts, the growth figures for earlier this year, the huge, the Strategic Defence Review, local transport, £15 billion going in, free school meals, Sizewell, social housing. Mr. Speaker, but she stands there to lecture us, and I say Liz Truss is obviously back in vogue, advising reform officially now, haunting the Tories, and I remind her that the Shadow Home Secretary, I think he was then Chief Secretary to the Treasury, he gave the Liz Truss budget, Mr. Speaker, 9.5 out of 10. The Leader of the Opposition said what was wrong with Liz Truss's budget was not necessarily the package, that was all right, it was the way it was sold. They've learned absolutely nothing.
Mr. Speaker, he loves talking about Liz Truss because he loves talking about Liz Truss. Why? Because he wants to hide from his own economic record. He's a coward. Every time he stands up there and talks about Liz Truss, it's because he is scared about talking about his record and what is happening to the economy out there. Let's bring it back to the U-turn, which he's running away from. A U-turn on a policy that his MPs went out defending time and time again. Let's go through what's happening here. 1 minute, they said it was right to take the winter fuel payment away, that there might be a run on the pound. The next minute, they said it was right to give it back. This is laughable. He stands there all puffed up and self-righteous. Why can't the Prime Minister just admit that he made a mistake?
Mr. Speaker, they left a £22 billion black hole that we had to fill. And that's why we took the right decisions. We've stabilised the economy. That's why we've seen 4 interest rate cuts. The triple lock is committed to on this side. They say it's unsustainable on that side. That's £470 for most pensioners and good Q1 growth. 3 weeks ago, I said that I wanted more pensioners to be eligible for winter fuel. I'm really pleased. We set out the threshold and the certainty that is needed. And she says I don't want to talk about my record. What about 3 trade deals, record investment, free school meals, breakfast clubs, social and affordable housing, Defence Review, Sizewell? We could go on all morning, Mr. Speaker, but we've got the Chancellor who's going to say even more in a minute. Mr. Speaker, I think she at the weekend said that she would be getting better in the role. She could start with apologising for the Liz Truss budget. That would be better.
Mr. Speaker, I get better every week. He gets worse. Yes, he gets worse. Last week, Mr. Speaker.
If you think that is a good look, it is a very bad look. And think twice before you try to shout somebody down in that way. Hey, Ben.
Mr. Speaker, last week he had to get his lines from the Russian embassy. I think we all know that he is getting worse, and what he does not want to talk about is how he is going to make the economy better. That is what the people out there want to hear, and he's got no answers. His trade deals have unraveled. The Strategic Defence Review, everyone out there is asking where's the money coming from, and the fact is he doesn't know how to balance the books. The Chancellor says the winter fuel payment U-turn won't be funded through higher borrowing. So will the Prime Minister admit that it will be funded by putting everybody's taxes up?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I think she let slip on the Matt Ford programme the other day that she rehearses her fury for PMQs. So a very good rehearsal this morning, I think. Mr. Speaker, she asked what we're doing. At the budget, we put record investment in our NHS and our public service. Record investment. And she comes every week to carp on about national insurance, but she doesn't stand there with the courage of her convictions and say she'll actually reverse it. And the reason she won't, because she won't stand up and say she's against the investment in the NHS. She won't stand up and say she's against the investment in our public services. And we'll all listen very carefully in just 20 minutes when the Chancellor lays out more record investment as to whether they welcome it or whether they say they wouldn't support it.
Mr. Speaker, every week I come here to tell him the truth. The truth that the economy is in a spiral because Labour, that's all of them, Labour put up taxes that cut growth. And we all heard the Prime Minister, he didn't rule out tax rises, so they are going to have to put up taxes even more. This is a spiral. And if that wasn't bad enough, Mr. Speaker, if that wasn't bad enough, this morning we heard that because of his terrible Chagos deal, Mauritius is scrapping income tax. Why on earth should the British taxpayer pay for £30 billion for tax cuts in Mauritius?
Mr. Speaker, Diego Garcia is a vital intelligence and strategic capability. And it's absolutely clear that legal uncertainty would compromise it in very short order. That is why they started the negotiations in relation to it. And no responsible Prime Minister would let that happen. We've secured the base for the long time. That has been welcomed by our allies, by the US, by NATO, by Australia, New Zealand, India. It's been opposed by our adversaries, Russia, China and Iran. And in the second column, we add reform, following Putin, and the Tories following reform.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister knows this has nothing to do with national security, but his bad negotiating. I've had the security briefings. It was a bad deal before, and it's still a bad deal. And then in half an hour, the Chancellor is going to stand up and tell us that everything is fine. But the truth is, she has made bad choices. Bad choices that mean higher inflation, bad choices that have led to lower growth, bad choices that have meant that jobs have been lost every single month since Labour came into office. That's hundreds of thousands of families who've lost their income in Stoke, in Grangemouth, in Luton. Those are their constituencies, businesses across the country. The Chancellor has lost all her headroom. She's fallen out with the Cabinet. She's making unfunded spending commitments which she promised not to do. Isn't the truth that we have got the wrong Chancellor and the wrong priorities?
The wrong choice they made was making her leader of the opposition.
Richard Bergen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and belated birthday greetings to you. Mr. Speaker, it's wrong for any Labour government. No Labour government should ever try to balance the books on the backs of disabled people. Yet in just a few weeks' time, that is what the Prime Minister will ask this House to do. Many of us will not be able to go along with that because it will mean that people who need assistance to cut up their food, to wash themselves, to dress themselves and to go to the toilet will lose the PIP they currently get. That's vital support. This week the Prime Minister changed direction on winter fuel payment. Will he do the same in relation to this and now drop these disability benefit cuts?
Mr. Speaker, it's very important we make the changes to our welfare system. It's not working. It needs reform. I think everybody agrees with that. It doesn't work for anyone. We will do so on a principled basis that those who can work should work. Those that want to work should be supported to do so, and that we must protect those with the most severe disabilities who will never be able to work. And we're doing that by ending reassessments and paying a new premium.
Liberal Democrats, Sir Ed Davey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I join others in wishing you belated happy returns for yesterday? And can I welcome the government sanctions of ministers in the Netanyahu government, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich? The violence they've incited, the settler violence they've incited against innocent Palestinians on the West Bank is intolerable, and the government were right to act. And as it's Carers Week, Mr. Speaker, can I pay tribute to the millions of unpaid family carers across the country and recognise the challenges that they face. Mr. Speaker, the last Conservative government left our health service on its knees. We've heard reports that the NHS will get extra funding in the spending review. If it does, we will support that. But does the Prime Minister agree that no amount of money for the NHS will solve its crisis unless we also invest to fix care? So without preempting the Chancellor's statement, will the Prime Minister reassure me that both social care and family carers will get the priority they deserve in the spending review?
Can I agree with him that the health crisis created by the previous government cannot be solved? They groan. That is exactly how the country feels about the last 14 years and the mess they made of everything. Yes, we do need to fix social care alongside the money that we're putting into the NHS. We're putting record amounts into the NHS. That's the right thing to do, and we're seeing the results. We promised 2 million extra appointments in the first year, of a Labour government. We've delivered 3 million, so there will be that extra funding. I would gently say to him, whilst he welcomes all the extra funding, he can't also at the same time simply say he's against any way of raising the money for the funding. There's an incompatibility there.
Sir Ed Davey. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister knows he's got a fairer and better way of funding NHS investment, and I regret the fact that he didn't answer my question on care. But, Mr. Speaker, moving on, the Prime Minister is right to increase defence spending, and later we'll hear the difficult choices the Chancellor has had to make, partly to fund that defence expenditure. But there are £25 billion of frozen Russian assets in the UK right now. Billions that could be used to stop Putin's war machine and to boost Britain's defence industry even faster. So at the G7 this weekend, will the Prime Minister try to seek an agreement to seize those frozen Russian state assets and use them to support Ukraine?
Well, as he knows, that is an issue that's being considered, but it is complicated, and there are a lot of countervailing factors that need to be carefully balanced in a decision that can be made. We are talking to allies about it, but I don't want to pretend to the House that there's an easy answer on this, because there isn't.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. More jobs, cheaper bills. That was our promise on net zero. If we can't meet those goals, then we must
and it's 90 minutes after 12. Dame Edna average? Anybody? That came in from Gerard. I think it's going to take some beating.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It's 21 minutes after 12. 21 seconds away. And the spending review is imminent, so that will begin approximately 12:30. Usually takes about 45 minutes or thereabouts. Natasha and Asma will be on hand to talk you through its contents and to provide you with immediate reaction. If you don't know what the Dame Edna Everage line was about, it was the somewhat improbable comments from Kemi Badenoch on at a podcast recording the other night that she's getting much better at PMQs. And she's more like a dame now, so that's why Gerard went for Dame Edna Average, a pantomime dame. And I don't think even critics of her would have expected her to make the same boast at the actual dispatch box.
Also, setting a bit of a rod over her back there to say I'm getting better and better every week.
Better every week. I mean, I'm a pretty arrogant man. You've probably not noticed this, Natasha,
I haven't noticed at all.
during our brief collaboration, but I'm getting better every week.
Yeah.
Nobody says that out loud.
That?
Nobody says that out loud.
You're setting yourself up for a huge fall when eventually you have a shocker at Prime Minister's questions, and which he has had some shockers.
Mike says, "What's at?" The mind boggles, Michael. The mind boggles.
Despite the fact of being a bit of a shopping trolley of a Prime Minister's questions with questions all over the place, actually, so talking about national insurance, the economy, unfunded spending cuts, winter fuel. She called it the terrible Chagos deal. He said, accusing him of not having properly stabilised the economy and blowing a black hole in the spending plans with their U-turn, which they've not said how they'll pay for. I thought actually it wasn't too bad of a showing from Kemi Badenoch, but for one reason really, I just don't think she's as rattled by him as she has been in the past, and I think she's keeping her cool a bit better. It's clear that both of them get under each other's skin.
Yes,
both Kemi Kemi Badenoch under Keir Starmer and Keir Starmer under Kemi Badenoch. They both, I think, really don't particularly like each other, and they know how to get to each other. But actually, I thought you saw enough animation, passion, and good arguments from both of them that actually, I thought it was an all right performance from Kemi Badenoch. But Keir Starmer, she just can't get anywhere near the goal, can she? She can't actually get any knockout blows because he is very, very good at Prime Minister's questions these days.
He gets better every week.
He gets better every week, yeah. He wasn't very good at Prime Minister's questions at one point when he first became leader.
I don't know that he's that good now, but it depends what you're up against, doesn't it? As I think someone just reminded us, my kids are getting better at their Sunday football matches every week, says Connor, which means you might have gone from losing 28-0 to losing 16-0. And technically you have got better. I thought the Liz Truss stuff was interesting because we took a call from Kaz in Ross-on-Wye, who was literally rendered homeless by Liz Truss. The interest rate rise that her landlord had to absorb saw him issue a Section 21, albeit with 6 months' notice, because he couldn't afford to keep paying the mortgage on the property that she rented from him. So she was evicted and she ended up homeless as a direct consequence of Liz Truss's fiscal event. So it seems to me that she's on a bit of a hiding to nothing when A, she says he doesn't talk about his own record when he's just spent most of the last answer talking about his own record, and B, why wouldn't a Labour leader not remind voters of what happens when the Tories are in power?
Yeah, I mean, look, we are going to be hearing that argument until the cows come home in the next 4 years. And Keir Starmer will want to link Kemi Badenoch to Liz Truss at every opportunity he can get. And actually, what we've seen in the last few weeks with his shift towards doing that for reform as well, accusing both of them of, fancy economics, the sums don't add up. It's a really interesting position for the Labour Party to be in because, 4 years ago, that was exactly what everybody was saying about Jeremy Corbyn. Just before Keir Starmer became leader, everybody said his sums didn't add up. So it's a really interesting message. And I think it does resonate with voters. We know that, time in time, day in, day out, look at the polling and people want to see a government that they feel handles the economy well. I don't think people can say that Labour are the economy is fantastic at the moment, that nobody's feeling better off right now. But actually, Keir Starmer's trying to say things are more stable than they were a year ago under the Conservatives. I think most people probably will agree with that things do feel a bit more stable. Are things all done, the land of milk and honey hasn't quite materialised yet. And I think that's going to be his really tricky moment today when the Chancellor gets up to announce her spending review. She's got to sort of allude to the fact that things are getting better, that there is this hope on the horizon and that this change that everybody, voted for in the election is actually going to come. But with the economy still stumbling, with growth still slow, with inflation still sticky, it's going to be a really, really hard sell to actually say to voters, things are going to get better, trust us.
And tariff on the horizon and the unreliability of Trump and the rest of it, there's not a lot to bet on, is there, from the government's point of view. Shall I read out some texts? Randomly, this from Isaac. Oh my lordy, there's been nothing quite so funny this year as Badenoch claiming I'm getting better every week. Chris writes, I'm getting better, and then does an emoji and writes, actually howled. Andrew writes, every week we have to listen to her practising for a job she already has. Alan points out, Richard Bergen rattled Starmer more than Kemi Badenoch did. We should probably mention that. Bergen very much from the left of the party, going after the plans to review PIP and disability payments. Yeah,
that's probably the most interesting part of PMQs today, actually. Richard Bergen, who, of course, from the left of the Labour Party, like you say, pressing the Prime Minister to go even further. And that's what happens when you, as a government, announce a U-turn. Backbenchers start getting a little bit confident with what else can we get. Yeah. And, of course, the disability benefits cuts, the welfare changes, that is going to be a lot for a lot of MPs to swallow. And the two-child benefit cap is something that a lot of Labour MPs privately behind the scenes want to see go as well. So is there more potentially of this to come, of this change in direction? I think probably.
Steve in Guildford writes, Starmer was second best today, best at deflecting embarrassing questions. And Tony, I am loving Keir Starmer today, and I want to know who's convincing Kemi Badenoch that she's getting better. Lol. The only thing I would wish is that the government stops saying that the U-turn is down to the economy.
It's just not.
It's irrelevant. It's relevant because it was the right thing to do regardless. I would respect a PM more who just changes their mind. It's a strength.
That is the problem, is that they're saying, well, the economy's looking better, that's why we've got the money, but they've still not said how they're going to pay for this, which is a problem when you're blaming Liz Truss, when you're blaming the Conservatives and Reform for not having their spending plans add up. If yours don't add up, if you don't say how you're going to pay for this £1.5 billion promise, it looks a bit of an own goal, really. So I don't think it works, and that's probably going to, I think, time in knots until we get to the budget.
Will there be any surprises? Will Rachel Reeves be pulling any rabbits out of her hat in the next half an hour? Yes?
I think she'll want to. We've seen the pitch rolling for this spending review for weeks, really, haven't we? We saw the Chancellor's speech last week where she was talking about spending lots of money in the North, infrastructure projects, £100 billion that she's borrowed thanks to loosening up her fiscal rules. She wants to offer some freebies, some sweeties, and to tell people that the economy is getting better. She needs to show it. She needs to show what she's doing. And look, this isn't a budget. It's no tax and spend decision, so there's not a lot she can do. But, we saw with what the Treasury are talking about this morning with more affordable housing, the bus cap fare is being extended. Those are the little things that really do kind of make a difference, I think, in people's lives. So I'm sure she will want to throw to some sort of rabbit.
We shall see. And sooner rather than later, I think we will not be taking the news bulletin at 12:30, which frees me to cross immediately back to the House of Commons as soon as Rachel Reeves gets to her feet, which puts us in that very popular position now of having to fill space constructively.
We haven't talked about your
Ed Davey.
Yeah.
Go on.
Oh, sorry. I thought that was what you were going to say. I'm running out of things to talk about. Ed Davey, talking about Israel sanctions. Rightly, where Kemi Badenoch didn't decide to go.
I don't think there's enough support for criticism behind her.
You don't?
Not on this very specific moment.
Of Israeli sanctions, or specifically the issue around it? These two men.
I don't think anyone would say that they don't deserve to be sanctioned. You can make a slightly Byzantine argument about the need for keeping diplomatic relations sweet or keeping the White House sweet, but Smotrich and the other one, Ben-Gvir, have such hideous records that you would struggle, I think, to set yourself up as a defender of their honour.
And nobody I've seen in the past 24 hours has done that.
Exactly.
I think the argument is, why are you sanctioning a government which you say is an ally of the United Kingdom? That's the problem. It's not something that the UK government can't quite square the circle of. You see, when we sanction Russian politicians, the government is happy to make the argument that the entire government, the entire administration is in the wrong. But we are moving towards that. The government has come leaps and bounds in changing their position in the past few weeks. And Ed Davey saying the government was right to act, and I back you.
And warm as well, Ed Davey. Wishing him a happy birthday, I think, is just basic good manners. But
I was mean about him off air, wasn't I?
But there's a warmth there that is absent from other parts of PMQs, and was certainly absent when the SNP got the third question.
Definitely. The SNP had a very harsh demeanour at Prime Minister's questions, and they really wanted to.
That's not a criticism.
No, not at all. Yeah. Just I think they were just as a party, as the Westminster leaders were more blunt, I think, in trying to differentiate themselves. And Ed Davey is happy, and I think people do respect, I think, the fact from Ed Davey that he is happy to say to the government when they've got things right. And actually, I think most people do quite like it when that happens. We were right to suggest that he talked about social care, and that is going to be a big question, I think, for after the spending review. We still don't have any sort of cross-party consensus on what a social care plan looks like. Wes Streeting has promised this time and time again. The last government promised it time and time again. It's just been kicked into the long grass. It's so expensive. That's why the government don't want to sort of grasp the nettle on this. Ed Davey saying, look, we cannot fix the NHS, we cannot fix our health service without looking at social care. It's on its knees, make it a priority. But I didn't hear anything from Keir Starmer today, which seemed to indicate that that's on the cards.
Indeed not. Time now 12:31, and that spending review absolutely next on the agenda. Rachel Reeves in the House, sitting beside Keir Starmer, who's just sort of mopping up the final bits of PMQs before the Speaker calls the Chancellor to lay out her spending plans for the foreseeable future. It's going to be the NHS and housing, isn't it, really?
Yeah, NHS, defence and housing, those are going to be the
should we
three
go
main
and
bits.
find out?
Yeah.
James O'Brien on LBC.